Hey everyone, and welcome back to another video on my channel. I hope everyone's doing well, but no matter how you're feeling, today is going to be a little bit better because I've got a new story for you. Today we're once again getting into some more disappearances, this time in the Ridley Creek State Park. I thought it might be fun to discuss a lesser known park. There are many state and national parks across the country that many people may never have heard of, and there's plenty of strange mysteries in each one of them. At the very least, I thought it would be cool that we could accomplish the feat of sharing a story you likely haven't heard before. The Ridley Creek State Park land was originally purchased in the 1960s and officially dedicated to public use in 1972. It covers over 2,600 acres in Delaware County, Pennsylvania, and includes parts of Edgemont, Middleton, and Upper Providence townships. Though it does have a variety of hiking trails, it's not uncommon for locals to just kind of walk through the woods freely. Aside from the usual park activities, this park also has a 300-year-old plantation that has been restored using nothing but 18th century tools. And on any given day, you can actually see interpreters and reenactors on those very grounds to this day. You can see them mending a fence or baking bread. It's actually really cool. They essentially recreate the lives of the former owners. They also have a formal garden area designed by the Olmsted brothers. According to the Wikipedia page, if it's accurate, this firm was established in 1898, making it the first architectural firm in the United States. Unfortunately, though, Ridley Creek also shares its fair share of tragedy. Much like many of the other state parks we cover, there is no shortage of tragic disappearances, unsolved murders, and much more going on within the borders of this small state park. More specifically, there is a Jane Doe case from 2016 that is still actively being investigated that initially sparked my attention to the state park in the first place. She was found approximately at 1 p.m. on January 1st, and her case has been stumping law enforcement ever since. But before we get into all that, I want to tell you an interesting piece of local history, just to set the mood a bit. Thanks to library archives, a current resident by the name of Carla Welsh found a newspaper article from 1902. And she instantly knew that others would be just as interested in seeing this as she was. She then shared the information on her social media, and it quickly spread through the small town like wildfire. Interestingly enough, it seemed that many people weren't even aware of this piece of forgotten history. And luckily, Carla discovered it just by chance and was able to resurface it for all of us to enjoy, or I guess, be aware of. This is the story of Pennsylvania's first and only known witch trial. This trial happened 9 full years before the infamous Salem witch trials began, and one of the women accused was a Delco woman known as the Witch of Ridley Creek. In 1683, a Swedish settler by the name of Margaret Mattsson lived on a farm in a very wooded area near Crum Creek. She lived there with her husband, who went by Niels. Allegedly, Margaret would say strange incantations over a great cauldron of boiling meat. Though, full disclosure, another Swedish woman by the name of Yeshro Hendrickson was also accused and ultimately sentenced, but I was ultimately unable to find any more details as to why or what led to this sentencing. At the time of the witch trials, the colony actually hadn't set up a real justice system yet, so there was no court system to be heard of. First, Margaret was brought before the council on February 7th, 1683, and on the 27th, she had her trial with a grand jury in Philadelphia. A petit jury, witnesses, the attorney general, and the governor were all there. She would plead not guilty, and witnesses would go on to claim that they heard that she was a witch through some very unreliable sources going around town. One man actually stood up and said 20 years prior he had heard that Mattsson was a witch through the grapevine. So basically, there was never any evidence that this woman had harmed anybody, had put spells on anybody. She just so happened to be foreign, probably spoke a little bit differently, probably was doing something just in her native tongue, and was scaring people. But to be honest, did you really think the witch trials were any different? I'm not really all that shocked, because when I imagined the whole witch hysteria in the 16 and 1700s, I kind of imagined it being much like this. I heard she was a witch. Margaret did have an interpreter to help her speak, but she didn't have a lawyer. Despite this, she did relatively well in defending herself. She constantly reminded the jury that each allegation was in fact only hearsay. The jury did reconvene and even came with a verdict that very day. Matson was found guilty of having the common fame of a witch, but not guilty in the form of which she stands indicted. I think this basically translates to, you definitely have the reputation of a witch, but we have no proof to show that you are actually a witch. The punishment was actually fairly light, especially for those days. Apparently, Margaret was only required to pay a £50 fine and practice good behavior for 6 months. Obviously, this is a very different result from what happens 9 years later in Salem, when people are basically just cutting heads off for no reason. Thankfully, this didn't end in some bloodshed. Anyways, that's it for this witchy story. Praise Shrek, hallelujah. Let's move on to the actual mysteries of this video. Okay, so cool history aside, let's get into some modern disappearances. Starting in 2012 with 44-year-old Teresa Mastrocola. She was a master sergeant with the Coast Guard and an avid hiker who would often leave town for days at a time to explore the wilderness. She also worked as an imaging equipment specialist at Delaware County Memorial Hospital, and it would be her co-workers there who would ultimately report her as missing when she failed to appear for a shift. On Sunday, December 2nd, she was seen leaving her home sometime between 9 and 10 a.m. that morning. A witness who saw her described her as getting into her car wearing her hospital scrubs, assumably showing that she was headed to work. She was also caught leaving work that same day on some surveillance footage from the hospital. But that would be the last time anyone would ever see her alive. Police began their search with Teresa's silver 2006 Mazda, but they would actually discover her body in Ridley Creek State Park on the following Saturday with no sign of her car anywhere. In fact, I can find no mention of the car ever being found anywhere in my research. One would definitely think this is a sign of foul play. Where possibly could her car have gone after she reached the park? The medical examiner ruled her death as helium inhalation causing asphyxiation, and ultimately ruled it as suicide. But does that mean that someone coincidentally happened to steal her car that same night? I mean, it's a big coincidence if so, but I guess it is a possibility. Or was it not really a suicide after all? There is very little known information about this case. Maybe we're missing a key detail to make this whole thing fall into place. Who knows? But as it stands currently, this is basically all we know about this story, and I'll definitely keep you updated if we get any more new information around this story. As for that Jane Doe case no one even knew about until 2016, on New Year's Day, when a couple was hiking through the park, they just so happened to veer off trail into one of the more densely wooded areas of the park, only to discover a body and immediately dial 911. State troopers arrived on the scene, and after a 20-minute trek to the area the couple had been, they then saw the remains. They were fully skeletonized and clearly had been there for quite some time. After their initial examination, investigators thought that she probably had died sometime in the winter of 2014. She was a slender, white female with brown hair and a prominent jawline. Though they originally believed her to be in her early 20s, that estimate was eventually revised and bumped up to 45. Her height ranged from 5'3" to 5'10". Unfortunately, this is an incredibly vague description. This description could probably be applied and be applicable to most women we know in our everyday lives. It doesn't really help anybody slim down anything. Investigators tried their damnedest to try to find any information or tips that could help identify this Jane Doe, but to no avail. Jane Doe's death was nearly impossible to determine, but police, for some reason, were rather confident that they could identify her rather shortly. Upper Darby Police Department Superintendent Mike Chitwood stated he believed it could be the remains of Amanda DeGio, who did go missing in 2014. This statement was taken very poorly by the family, though. Amanda's sister Nicole made a statement on Facebook saying the comments were inappropriate and unnecessary. After receiving information that the remains were in fact not her sister, Amanda had all 4 of her wisdom teeth pulled, and Jane Doe still had all 4 of their wisdom teeth. When the the 24-year-old mother of two from Drexel Hill vanished, she left behind her phone, her wallet, and didn't bring any extra clothing, though she was not reported missing until August 27th. She had not been seen by her family since returning from Florida in the first week of June, and since it's reported that she doesn't drive, it's unknown how she left home. Nicole worried her sister was being held against her will somewhere, and often searched for her sister in areas well known for drug use and other things. She mentions that she went and looked everywhere in every bad neighborhood possible where she could think somebody would be holding someone. I should be upfront and note that on the FBI's website, it does note that Amanda was a known heroin addict, but I don't think that makes their life in this case any less important. Drug use is a ugly thing, and we all most likely have family members who have dealt with it in some form or another. Addiction can really ruin somebody's life, even if they are a great person. So we shouldn't use that as who they are. They're still valuable, and so many cases get swept under the rug because of these connotations. Nobody is lesser in society because of their hardships. Amanda was also known to suffer from bipolar disorder. Though the case is now over 8 years old, investigators are still diligently looking into what happened to Amanda. Investigators are in fact still following every lead. This past September, local and federal authorities searched a property of a home on Red Bump Road in Nottingham. Amanda's mother and sister were on scene that day, but unfortunately no closure would be found. No remains were found on the property, and Amanda's case remains unsolved. With another case so similar, the odds that a match would be made seemed to be in the investigators' favor. Just kidding. That's not really the case most of the time, is it? Jane Doe remained unidentified. Her dental records and DNA were checked against the National Missing Persons Database, but no dice. They even had isotope analysis done on her hair and teeth to help determine maybe where she lived. And it revealed that she was most likely born in Pennsylvania or a surrounding state. Eventually, investigators turned to the Florida Institute of Forensic Anthropology and Applied Science in order to create a facial reconstruction of the victim. With a new image to show to the public, authorities were feeling reinvigorated that someone may just recognize Jane Doe. Unfortunately, though, they still weren't so lucky. When the case began to run cold, officials released a description of everything found with the body, which consisted of Gloria Vanderbilt brand blue jeans, a blue winter jacket, and a pair of size 9 black totes boots. Nearby was a green plaid blanket and a Route 66 backpack, a navy blue canvas bag, a pair of size 9 gray and pink sneakers in the Skechers brand, a box cutter, and 2 empty pill bottles. Again, this resulted in 0 leads. It seemed as if nobody at all on this entire planet was missing Jane Doe of Ridley Creek. At a dead end, the investigators decided to reinvestigate the victim's clothing. Now that the mud had dried, 3 gold rings had fallen from the victim's pocket. Each was yellow gold, but the metal had darkened from decay. One was a Clodagh ring with a green stone. Apparently it's like an Irish ring, commonly used for friendships, engagements, and weddings. So basically it could mean anything. One of the rings seemed to have initials carved into them. They could definitely make out the letter C, but the second letter was a bit too distorted. It could either be CA or CR. Some have theorized that Jane Doe could have been a homeless woman who succumbed to the elements in the winter, and that could explain why none of her loved ones are aware that she's missing or care, I guess. Then there are those who have made this crazy story that this woman would sell these gold rings in the park. But again, there is no evidence to support any of these rumors and are probably just local speculation. Those rings could have been of great sentimental value to Jane Doe, but I guess we will never know. Maybe she did sell them. Maybe they weren't even hers. But since they're found in the body, you gotta assume they are. I can confidently say that I don't think she expected to die the night she did. We must consider the way the rings were found on her body though. Since they were concealed and hidden and not on the body itself, maybe she was hiding from someone or hiding them from someone. Maybe she was in fear of being robbed. Like I said, this is all speculation, but who knows, right? Again, if she was even homeless to begin with, this also could just be a habit of hiding your valuable things. But I do struggle to find an explanation as to why no one has been able to identify her, even with all of the technology we have today. Let's close today's video with a discovery made just this past March, when a volunteer organization by the name of Adventures with Purpose sent divers to Ridley Creek Marina. This group has actually been responsible for solving multiple missing persons cases in this manner. This time, they were contacted by the family of James Amabile, a man who went missing in 2003 at the age of 38. The day James disappeared, he was on his way back from the babysitter's house picking up his children. He called the babysitter to say he would be about 5 to 10 minutes late picking up his daughters. After that call, they never heard from him again. The location his body was ultimately discovered is actually only a couple of blocks away from the babysitter's home, which only makes the situation that much more tragic. Perhaps there is something to be grateful for, though. Apparently, he was the only person in the vehicle at the time of this accident. Had this car crash happened after he picked up his daughters, this could be a much more tragic situation. James wore an insulin pump and would become disoriented due to low blood sugars. It is believed that this played a part in his demise. Thankfully, now the family can finally have closure and peace knowing this. While the license plate from the car was confirmed to be that of James, they could not confirm the identity until the coroner took a look over his body. His identity was 100% confirmed with his dental records. And honestly, who knows how long James's case could have gone unsolved if it wasn't for this dive team. The vehicle was submerged in 24 feet of water, and apparently a pylon was drilled through the front unknowingly by workers. Now, on the surface, this may seem like a pretty open and shut case. A genuine accident, if you will. And I agree, it probably is, especially with the note about that insulin pump. It does seem like all the right boxes were checked, and we can rest easy knowing the man was discovered and eventually brought home. There is one singular line in an article I read that actually kind of makes me question that. On CBSNews.com, it states, "The divers chose where to look due to an anonymous tip," which begs the question, who the hell knew where to look? Like we said, this was 24 feet submerged under the surface. It's not like anybody would casually just see that, and it's not like this was a spot that people actually dived or snorkeled in or anything like that. It's a relatively random area of water. Now, it was James's family who initially reached out to Adventures with Purpose, but as far as I can tell from all the coverage and information made available online, the actual tip of where the car may be located didn't come from the family, and we don't know who it came from. Regardless, the case was ruled an accident, and is therefore unlikely to receive any more investigation. But I just can't help but wondering, accident or not, it's hard to imagine what James must have went through in his final moments. I can't imagine being the family as well, not knowing what happened to him for 2 decades. But hey, that's life for you. It's terrifying, and every day could be our last. So definitely hold your loved ones tight. In the summer of 1985, 11-year-old Jesse Morgan and his friends were playing a game similar to hide and seek in Bear Brook State Park, located in their hometown of Allenstown, New Hampshire. One of the boys called out to the others, revealing his hiding place because he'd found something more exciting than their game. It was a slightly rusted, dark blue 55-gallon steel barrel with a piece of plastic poking up beneath the lid. They managed to slightly loosen the lid, releasing an odor that resembled spoiled milk. When they were unable to open the lid all the way, one of the boys kicked the side of the barrel, knocking it over to its side. A white liquid trickled out. Again, Jesse and his friends mistook this for rotten milk, and they went home, leaving the barrel in the woods. In November 1985, Officer Ron Montplaisir of the Allenstown Police Department received a call from a hunter who believed he had found a barrel containing a dead body. Montplaisir was used to dealing with typical small-town call-outs, so at first he thought it was more likely that a deceased pet or deer carcass had been dumped. But upon looking inside the barrel, he found himself face to face with a decomposed human skull. Montplaisir was the only police officer on duty, which was normal for Allenstown, so he called in the other members of the force and deputized locals to secure the area. Jesse Morgan's father was deputized, and with shock, the Morgan family realized it was the same barrel Jesse and his friends played with a few months earlier. And so began a mystery that would span over 3 decades. Before I get into this video, I want to take a moment to credit and shout out Bear Brook, a podcast hosted by Jason Moon and produced by New Hampshire Public Radio. A lot of information in this video was sourced from there. It's an excellent investigative podcast. If you want to hear more about the case after this video, it's on Spotify and most other podcast platforms. They break down each aspect of the case in detail, and there's a second season exploring a new mystery coming later this year. I recommend it if you're interested in true crime. I'll leave a link to their website in the description. I also want to shout out Justine Perry for helping me put together this script and all of this information. She was very, very helpful, and I truly appreciate her. If you want to show her some love, you can find links to her other work in the description. Now, let's get into this video. The barrel contained the remains of a woman and a female child. The remains were nude, dismembered, and decomposed to the point that they were partly skeletonized. The bodies were wrapped in plastic and tied with electrical wire. They had possibly been dismembered to fit inside the barrel. The cause of the death for both victims was blunt force trauma to the head. Investigators estimated the bodies had been in the barrel for anything from a few months to several years. The woman was thought to be in her 20s or early 30s at the time of her death, and the girl between 8 to 10 years old. The New Hampshire State Police took charge of the investigation while the Allenstown Police continued to canvass for information locally. Back then, there wasn't the level of forensic examination we have these days. The victims were thought to potentially be mother and daughter, so investigators tried to match them to missing mother-daughter reports. Campground records in the Bear Brook area were checked, and detectives also tried to find a match in the FBI's database of dental records. However, any leads turned out to be dead ends. In 1986, the first composite sketches of the victims were released. The decomposed state of the victims' remains meant there wasn't much to go on, but the sketches were based on the victims' hair, bone, and teeth structure. This gave the public some idea of what the victims might have looked like, but unfortunately, this didn't really lead to any new information. The bodies were released for burial in 1987. The victims were buried together, and their gravestone read, "Here lies the mortal remains known to only God of a woman aged 23 to 33 and a girl aged 8 to 10. Their slain bodies were found on November 10, 1985 in Bear Brook State Park. May their souls find peace in God's loving care." The case remained cold for 15 years. In the year 2000, John Cody was a detective with the state police's major crime unit. Each officer in the unit was assigned 2 or 3 cold cases with the expectation they'd work on these in their spare time. Cody was assigned the Bear Brook murders. He decided to visit the area where the barrel was discovered to get a visual of the scene described in his case notes. He drove to Allenstown and hiked to the place where the barrel was found. He widened his perimeter to get a better sense of the area and made a startling discovery. On its side, next to a boulder partially concealed by greenery, lay a barrel identical to the one photographed in his case notes. Dark blue, 55 gallons. Cody tried to convince himself it wasn't what he feared. This was no longer possible after opening the barrel to find human remains. There were 2 more bodies, just 300 feet away from where the first barrel had been found 15 years earlier. The second barrel contained the partly skeletonized remains of 2 infants, both female, one aged 1 to 3 and the other 2 to 4. Like the victims found in the first barrel, they had suffered severe, blunt trauma to the head. There was little doubt that they had been killed by the same perpetrator or perpetrators. Investigators were also confident the second barrel had been there when the first one was discovered. This understandably led to anger in the community. Many people thought the police, both local and state, should have found the second barrel shortly after the first was discovered, and the quality of the 1985 investigation was brought into question. However, at this point, it's worth considering the terrain of the Bear Brook State Park. The park is a 10,000-acre preserve. It's one of the largest state parks in New Hampshire, spanning 15 square miles and covering more than half of Allenstown. Popular public amenities such as picnic areas and an archery range are easily accessible, but other areas of the park are overrun by wild and dense woodland. 300 feet, the distance between the 2 barrels, is the length of a football field, not including the end zones. New York's Statue of Liberty and London's Big Ben both stand just over 300 feet. Large blue whales can weigh 150 tons and grow up to 100 feet long. meaning the length of 3 blue whales in a line is the approximate distance between the first barrel and the second barrel. In an open space, this is not particularly far, but it's more complicated when you consider the tangled forest, swampy landscape, and all the other things that factor in between when it comes to nature. Technically, the barrels were found on a strip of private land adjacent to the park, but the area was often mistakenly used by visitors to the park, such as Jesse Morgan and his friends, and the hunter that found the first barrel. So what do you think? Was the 1985 investigation subpar? Or was it an understandable error that the second barrel was missed? The only consolation for those angered by the delay to the discovery of the second barrel is that it seems unlikely finding the second barrel in 1985 would have made much difference to the investigation because once again, investigators were unable to identify any of the victims. The victims from the first barrel were exhumed from the grave. It was later confirmed the adult victim was the mother of the oldest and youngest child victims, but not the 2 to 4-year-old found in the second barrel. She became known as the middle child because of her age relative to the other child victims, not to be confused with a middle sibling because she wasn't biologically related to the others, and it was unknown how she came to be with the other 3 victims. Radioisotope testing of the remains showed the middle child was born and grew up in a different part of the country to the other victims, but they had been together for the 6 months prior to their deaths. You can actually find much more information on this specific part on episode 3 of the Bear Brook podcast. Some people think the murder of Danny Paquette is a factor in why the second barrel wasn't found in 1985. On November 9th, 1985, the day before the first barrel was reported, a man named Danny Paquette was welding in his backyard in Hooksett, New Hampshire, when he was shot dead. The bullet came from the woods near the house, so at first police thought it could have been a hunting accident. However, as investigation progressed, detectives learned Paquette was a Lothario that plausibly could have had enemies. New Hampshire State Police were spread thinly dealing with 2 murder cases at once. At the time, New Hampshire had an average of 15 murders per year. A more cynical view is that the Bear Brook murders were deliberately neglected because the Paquette case hadn't identified victim and suspects with motives. It might have been considered more exciting than a case with 2 unknown victims. Despite initial optimism that the Paquette murder would be promptly solved, this case also went cold, and Paquette's death was largely considered a hunting accident after all, rather than a premeditated killing. That was until the early 2000s after the Hooksett chief of police hired a private investigator to go back over the case. This investigator found inconsistencies in the information originally provided by Paquette's stepdaughter, and the truth unraveled. Eric Windhurst was 17 when he shot Danny Paquette to avenge his 15-year-old friend, Melanie Paquette, who had accused her stepfather of molesting her. Windhurst was released from prison on parole in 2020 after serving 14 years inside. His original sentence was 15 to 36 years. Melanie claimed she didn't ask Windhurst to kill her stepfather, but the judge did not believe her and she was sentenced to 3 to 6 years in prison. Although the Paquette case might have initially detracted attention away from the Bear Brook murders, the Paquette case being solved after 20 years injected hope into the Bear Brook mystery. In 2009, it was given to the New Hampshire Cold Case Unit, which was formed partially because the Paquette case proved that cold cases could be solved with enough resources and personnel assigned to the job. Unfortunately, time went on with none of the 4 Bear Brook victims identified. In a bizarre twist of events, the killer's name would be unearthed first. On New Year's Eve 1999, Elaine Ramos hosted a party for her family and friends at her California home. She was delighted when her cousin, Yunsun Jun, asked if she could bring a date. Both their families had immigrated to the United States from Korea when they were young. Yunsun was in her mid-40s. Elaine thought that maybe she had struggled with dating because she often felt like an outsider in the country. Not that there's anything wrong with being single in your 40s, by the way. However, Elaine recalls that when she met Yinsun's boyfriend, Larry Vanner, a chill ran down her back, unlike anything she'd experienced before. Elaine described Vanner as older than Yinsun, balding on the top, scruffy brown hair on the sides, and wore a mustache and had poor personal hygiene. She said the only thing appealing about him honestly were his blue eyes. He claimed to be a retired army colonel, but snapped at Elaine for questioning him when she made polite conversation about this. He was working as a handyman when he met Yunsen. They met when she hired him to make repairs to her own house. Yunsen seemed happy, so Elaine tried to be supportive. But she and other family members raised concerns about Vanner, which led to Yunsen distancing herself from her family in 2000. She said nobody wanted her to be happy and they should just leave her alone. This was out of character for Yunsen, so her family feared Vanner was influencing her and deliberately isolating her from her loved ones. Vanner moved into Yunsen's home in Richmond, California. They got married in 2001 in an unofficial Star Trek-themed ceremony held in their backyard. Elaine wasn't invited, as you can imagine. Yunsen did, however, remain close to her friend Renee Rose. In the early summer of 2002, Yunsen didn't phone Renee when she said she would, and they didn't turn up to a trip they were scheduled to take together. Renee left several voice messages for Yunsen, but only ever heard back from Vanner. He made excuses for his wife's absence, ranging from her going to stay with her ill mother to not wanting to speak to Renee anymore. Like many of Yunsen's loved ones, Renee was suspicious of Vanner. Renee told him that unless Yunsen herself said their friendship was over, she would call the police. And that's exactly what she did. Vanner was eventually brought in for questioning. Roxanne Grunheed was a detective on the case. She said initially the police only wanted to speak to him to confirm Yunsen was safe, but they became suspicious when his story kept changing regarding her whereabouts. Suspicions increased when a search of his name and birth date only brought up an index number. These are assigned to people without valid ID. He was fingerprinted, and this resulted in his previous criminal activity coming to light, as well as other fake names, including Gerald Mockerman and Curtis Kimball. Kimball was the earliest name on record. In 1989, he was charged with child abandonment. He spent 18 months in a California state prison. He left town on the day he was released, violating his parole and presumably taking on a new identity. Police searched Yunsen's home. They found a waist-high pile of cat litter in a basement crawl space in the garage where Yunsen worked on her pottery, one of her passions. Forensics uncovered a mummified foot wearing a flip-flop within the litter. Yunsen's dismembered body was soon found after. She had been bludgeoned to death and suffered blunt force trauma to the head. Grunheed confirmed with a local pet store that a man matching Vanner's description had purchased a large amount of cat litter. Vanner has told a neighbor he was dealing with a rat infestation, so not to worry if they smelled anything unusual. In November 2002, Vanner was arrested for Yunsen's murder. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison the following year after pleading guilty to the horrific act of violence. He died in prison of natural causes in December 2010. This meant he wasn't alive when his real identity was eventually uncovered or when further crimes surfaced. Roxanne Grunheed thinks Vanner might have pleaded guilty to discourage her from digging deeper into his past. But she wasn't discouraged, and this led to shocking discoveries. Investigators had a nagging feeling that the daughter Vanner was imprisoned for abandoning in the 80s might not have been his biological child after all. After ordering the completion of a DNA test that was left unfinished in the 80s, the results confirmed the suspicions investigators held. Vanner and the child were not blood related. In 1986, Vanner, who was then going by the name of Gordon Jensen, arrived at a holiday host RV park in California with a 5-year-old girl he claimed was his daughter. He said her name was Lisa. Richard and Catherine Decker were an elderly couple staying at the park at the time. They befriended Gordon and Lisa, and they played with their grandson all the time when he was visiting. Richard and Catherine became worried for Lisa when they noticed she was getting very thin. She also seemed somewhat neglected and she didn't have any toys. However, they felt sorry for Gordon, who claimed Lisa's mother died, leaving him a single parent. He cried to the Deckers over his alleged bereavement, and they had no reason to not believe him. Gordon admitted he was finding it difficult to cope with Lisa on his own. The Deckers suggested their adult daughter and her husband could adopt Lisa, as they were struggling to have a child of their own. Gordon agreed to a trial adoption, so the Deckers took Lisa to San Bernardino to introduce her to their daughter and her husband. It was when Lisa was away from Gordon and solely in their care that they noticed signs of abuse, and Lisa spoke about how Gordon had mistreated her. Details about the abuse Lisa suffered are limited, but it seems probable that she was molested. The Deckers went to the police. Gordon Jensen had left the RV park by this time, and any details he had given about himself turned out to be false. A fingerprint pulled from his abandoned vehicle led to the match with a Curtis Kimball, who had previously been arrested for drunk driving with Lisa in the car. However, this was also a dead end because no concrete identity documents were attached to that name either. Every time one identity would be unmasked, it was like he was wearing another mask underneath. This is how he would later become known as the Chameleon Killer. Lisa was then taken into foster care. She had not been officially adopted by the Deckers, so they were not able to keep her. She was later adopted by a different family. In 1988, the police tracked down Curtis Kimball by chance after he was arrested in San Luis Obispo, in California, for stealing a car. He said his name was Gerald Mockerman, but his fingerprints were a match for Curtis Kimball, a man wanted for child molestation and abandonment. In 1989, Kimball accepted a plea deal. He pled guilty to the child abandonment charges, and in return, the molestation and vehicular charges were dropped. The authorities had concerns that Lisa might have been kidnapped and wasn't in fact Kimball's daughter. A blood sample then had been taken from Lisa, but as mentioned earlier, the paternity test wasn't completed at this time. A blood sample was never taken from Kimball. The reason for this is entirely unknown, but some have speculated the plea deal closed the case and it was subsequently forgotten. It's frustrating because had the paternity test been completed, Kimball would have been facing kidnap charges. This could have put a dangerous man behind bars for a significant length of time, instead of a meager 18 months. Grunheed's 2003 discovery that Lisa wasn't Vanner's biological child prompted a lot of questions about her actual identity. Investigators contacted the San Bernardino authorities because they had jurisdiction over Lisa's case. It must have been a shock for Lisa to discover at 22 years old that her name was not Lisa and her father was actually not her father. The investigation into her identity went nowhere because Kimball, now in prison for murder of Yun Sun Jun, refused to provide any information on how Lisa came to be in his care. 10 years later, when Lisa was 32 years old, Detective Headley took over the case. All his leads went nowhere until Lisa herself suggested sending her DNA to a genealogy website. They connected with distant relatives online, but these people turned out to be too far removed to know anything about Lisa or her parents. In desperation, Headley contacted a not-for-profit organization called DNAadoption.com that helped adopted children find their biological parents. This is how Headley met Barbara Raventer. She initially began studying genealogy as a hobby in retirement, but with talent and hard work, she rose to become a leading name in the field. Together with Headley and a growing number of volunteers, including some of Lisa's distant relatives, Barbara Raventer followed the branches of Lisa's family tree, asking possible relatives to be tested until they got to the root. It took over a year, around 100 volunteers, and approximately 10,000 hours of work, but they found the name of Lisa's mother. Initially, Headley was disheartened because a search of the police database suggested this woman didn't exist. It turned out she didn't show up in police records because she had been inactive on voting and driving databases for a long time. This is because she went missing in 1981. After speaking to relatives that remembered Lisa, she finally discovered her birth name, Dawn Boudin. Her mother, Denise Boudin, disappeared from New Hampshire shortly after Thanksgiving with baby Dawn and her boyfriend who went by the name of Robert Bob Evans. This was another alias for the man who also used the names Curtis Kimball and Gordon Jensen. We don't know for sure that Kimball killed Denise Boudin, but unfortunately it seems likely considering she's been missing for so long and became separated from Lisa, and Kimball has a track record of violence against women and children. Lisa has asked for privacy amid the attention around Kimball's crimes, but we know she's married with 3 children, and in a statement released by the police on her behalf, she is said to be living a happy and secure life. For the purposes of this video, I'll call her Lisa to avoid confusion. I'm not sure what name she goes by now, and I haven't tried to find out in respect to her privacy. If it wasn't for Lisa's friendship with the Deckers, it's possible she wouldn't be alive today. What's even more disturbing is that when 5-year-old Lisa was asked if she had any brothers or sisters, she replied that she did, but they died from eating grass mushrooms when they went camping. These siblings she referred to might not have been biological siblings or have existed at all. We'll probably never know for certain, but it's a chilling indication that there could have been more victims out there, yet to be discovered. In a press conference in 2017, Jeff Strelzin, a prosecutor from the New Hampshire Attorney General's office, announced that the man responsible for Yunsun Jun's murder and the abandonment of 5-year-old Lisa was also the biological father of the middle child in the Bear Brook case, the toddler found in the second barrel who wasn't related to the other 3 victims. This discovery came about because investigators now knew Denise Boudin went missing from New Hampshire in 1981 and the first barrel was discovered in 1985. DNA tests were undertaken to find out if Denise was the adult victim. It was not her, but the connection between Denise Boudin and Robert Evans/Curtis Kimball led to another DNA test that found Kimball was the biological father of the middle child. All 4 Bear Brook victims were still unidentified at this point, but detectives were closing in on the killer. Kimball died in prison in 2010, so couldn't be questioned, but more connections between him and the Bear Brook murders would soon come to light. Remarkably, helping Lisa discover her birth name wasn't where Barbara Ray Venter's involvement in this case ended, but also used her genealogy talents to uncover the birth name of the chameleon killer. Her work in general has proven groundbreaking in recent years. She has successfully found killers and victims from cold cases where investigators had the DNA of the person they wanted to identify. Most genealogy websites currently aim to keep law enforcement out for data protection reasons. However, others such as GEDmatch are open to being used to solve crimes. The chameleon killer never uploaded his DNA online, but his relatives did. Even if it was a distant relative who uploaded their DNA to one of these websites, as we saw in Lisa's case, this could be used to trace closer relatives. Lisa's case took around 10,000 hours to crack. In contrast, it took Ray Venter just 10 hours to track down the chameleon killer. The man that went by Gordon Jensen, Curtis Kimball, Bob Evans, Gerald Mockersman, as well as many other aliases, had 4 children whilst going by his birth name. A DNA test from one of his daughters finally confirmed his identity. Over 30 years after the first barrel was found, his name was Terry Peter Rasmussen. Born in 1943, Terry Rasmussen grew up in Arizona and Colorado. He joined the Navy in 1961, where he trained as an electrician. He served for 6 years, then left the Navy and worked in his parents' shoe shop in Hawaii. He married in 1968 and moved to Arizona. Twin girls were the first of 4 children he had with his wife. The marriage broke down when the twins were around 6 years old. His children rarely saw their father after their parents split and Rasmussen moved away. He turned up unexpectedly a few months after the split with a woman, but being so young, his children were unable to really give many details about her, if any at all. It's possible she was the adult victim from the first barrel or the mother of the middle child. Unfortunately, the DNA of the Bear Brook victims was too degraded for the same method of genealogy tracing that uncovered Rasmussen's identity to work. But Ray Venter and her team were not giving up quite yet. Rebecca Heath, who usually goes by Becky, spends most of her free time web sleuthing. She investigates mysteries and missing persons cases by scouring online message boards, especially forums where family members post about loved ones that are either officially missing or with whom they've lost touch. Interested in the Bear Brook murders, Becky decided to search the web for family members that might have posted about the victims. She focused on the late 70s and early 80s, as this is the period in which the younger victims were born and then later went missing. Anyone that had been seen after 1985 could essentially be ruled out. She also focused on posts from people based in New Hampshire and California, as this is where Terry Rasmussen is known to have spent a lot of his time. It definitely wasn't easy work because posts were often out of date, either because the OP, original poster, didn't provide an update when the person they were seeking was found, or their contact details had expired. Becky felt like she was closing in on something important when she found a message posted in 2000 from someone looking for their half-sister who was born in California in the mid-70s. The writer said they had told the parents of her half-sister were dead. Knowing Rasmussen had lied about people being deceased in the past, Becky decided to search for an official record confirming their mother's death, a record she couldn't find. In 2003, a man commented on the post saying he was trying to find his sister who had 2 children when they lost touch. He was wondering if the OP's half-sister could be one of the children. In 2014, someone else commented saying they believed the mother was her missing sister. This was a missing family whose ages and timelines matched the Bear Brook victims. Becky posted about this in a Facebook group for the Bear Brook mystery in 2017, but her post didn't get much interest or response, so she just let it go. But later, after listening to the Bear Brook podcast, she had a gut feeling that she had been on to something before. So she went back to the forum and contacted the family. One family member mentioned the mother had been married to a man named Rasmussen. She couldn't remember the man's first name, but thought it may have been Terry. This was after Terry Rasmussen had been announced as the suspected killer of the Bear Brook victims. This tied the missing mother to the Bear Brook case. Not wanting to share her suspicions with the family in case she was wrong, Becky contacted Detective Headley in October of 2018. Around the same time, Barbara Ray Venter was making groundbreaking progress with the hair of the Bear Brook victims. She was testing autosomal DNA, which is found inside the nucleus of a cell, and it had previously been considered impossible to recover autosomal DNA from strands of hair that were no longer attached to the root because DNA inside the hair root cells shatter when it becomes part of the strand. But through trial and error, Ray Venter and her colleagues were actually able to resemble that broken autosomal DNA found in the rootless hair of the victims. Her work confirmed Becky Heath's theory, and the victims were finally named. The mother, Marilise Elizabeth Honeychurch, was in her mid-20s when she died. She was born in Connecticut in 1954. Her sisters remember her as bubbly and quirky with a good sense of humor. She married twice before meeting Terry Rasmussen and had a daughter with each husband. One of her sisters said she was excited to be a mother and loved her children dearly. Marilise went missing around Thanksgiving in 1978 after introducing Terry to her family at her mother's home in California. Her family think that there had been an argument between Marilise and her mother about Terry's suitability as a partner. After this, they never heard from Marilise again. It sounds eerily like what happened with Yun Sun Jun and her family. All this evidence suggests Rasmussen was a physically and emotionally abusive partner that isolated his victims from their family. Marilise's eldest daughter, Marie Vaughn, is believed to have been between 6 and 8 at her time of death, and Marilise's youngest daughter, Sarah McWaters, was possibly as young as 11 months when she died. Becky Heath stayed in touch with Marilise's family. She said it was heartbreaking seeing photographs of Marilise and her daughters. The composite sketches were close, despite the artist having so little to go on. So we need to pay attention to the composite sketch of the middle child. Unfortunately, the middle child, Rasmussen's biological daughter, is still unidentified. We hope that one day she can be named and her identity can be returned to her. She could have family out there waiting for news of their missing loved one. New Hampshire police encourage anyone with information to please come forward. She is believed to have been between 2 and 4 years of age at the time of her death. She was likely Caucasian with a small amount of Asian, African, and/or American Indian ancestry. She had slightly wavy brown hair and an overbite, which might have been noticeable. She was possibly anemic. Genealogy studies and knowledge of Rasmussen's timeline suggest she was likely born in Texas, but might have been born in California or Arizona. She and her mother possibly have family in Mississippi, specifically Pearl River County. As mentioned earlier, there are fears that Don Budin and the middle child's mother could be other victims. We can only hope that the new information will surface in the future. I will keep you updated if I hear anything. The last major update in this case was the identification of Marilyse Honeychurch and her 2 daughters, which happened recently in 2019. So there is a chance further developments could emerge over time. Other possible victims are the siblings Lisa mentioned and unidentified woman found in an abandoned refrigerator in 1995 in San Joaquin County, California. The woman suffered blunt force trauma to the head, and the way the body was dumped resembles the Bear Brook barrels to some extent. The fridge contained a brand of milk that was only delivered in an area Rasmussen was known to be at the time. Former San Joaquin County Sheriff Assistant John Huber believes Rasmussen might be responsible for the woman's death, but it will be difficult to say with any degree of certainty unless she is identified. We might never know how many people Rasmussen actually murdered. I'll post a follow-up video if I hear any significant developments. Today we're going to discuss the mysterious case of 4 Chinese investigative geologists who went missing and died while on the job in November of 2021. Early on, the case drives interesting parallels to a case we discussed in a previous video. One where a perfectly healthy family of 3 and their dog were found dead near Yosemite National Park, also in the year of 2021. These cases share early theories surrounding toxic algae exposure and potentially contaminated drinking water. If you want to hear more about this case, you can check out that video. It's called Yosemite National Park is Hiding Its History, and you can find it on my channel or in the description down below. However, when you dig a little deeper into the mysterious death of these men, you'll find that these 2 cases aren't exactly the same. It's true. Both cases offer varying levels of mystery, sadness, and each acts as a sort of cautionary tale of their own. On the one hand, you have a family who seems to have perished from hyperthermia, which is when the core body temperature rises and a lot of unpleasant things start happening, like extreme heat exhaustion and dehydration. Then on the other hand, you have 4 men who some believe have suffered from hypothermia, the opposite of hyperthermia, but equally as deadly. You notice that I said some believe the men suffered hypothermia. Well, I guess that's the big difference here, because unlike the Yosemite case, one which received lots of coverage and was widely agreed upon, not to mention solved, not everyone agrees with the cause of death assigned to these 4 men. What's frustrating is there doesn't seem to be much mainstream media coverage on this one. There weren't various news sources covering the story or spreading awareness. In fact, I couldn't find a single story that broke in the United States about this at all. No one seems to be discussing this in the mainstream. But that doesn't mean that no one is discussing this case at all. Because while the hypothermia theory is widely accepted by Chinese mainstream medication, there are still several individuals, including geologists themselves, who greatly disagree. So, let's get into it and find out why. On November 13th, 2021, 4 investigative geologists from Kunming Natural Resources Comprehensive Survey Center of the China Geological Survey entered the Ailao Mountains in Yunnan to survey forestry resources. Among them were 25-year-old Zhang Jingbang, who was last seen wearing a yellow storm jacket and thermal underwear. Yang Min, who was 27, and Zhang Yu, who was 32, were also wearing camouflage clothing and thermal underwear, while Lai Yu, 29, was wearing a down jacket. Between them, they had over 20 types of tools and more than enough food for the intended duration of their trip. Zhang carried a gray-blue backpack with a blue-gray backpack with a compass and tablet, and Zhang Yu carried a camouflage bag with food and homework tools. The bag included an RTK, or a real-time kinematic, positioning system, a tablet, computer, forest compass, engineering shovel, machete, snake medicine, bear spray, measuring tapes, power banks, and many other similar supplies. According to some reports from Chinese newspapers, the survey center had undertaken forestry resource surveys in Yunnan and Guangdong provinces since 2019. These 4 geologists were in their prime, all having apparently served in the armed police force before going to work in the Kunming Geological Bureau. Their capabilities overall were more advanced than your average geologist, to say the least. They were practically skilled at field survival and adaptability, having done a lot of preparatory work before starting the actual survey. They even set up mechanical compasses and RTK signal equipment, which we will most definitely discuss as we move forward. Basically, I'm saying these men were incredibly prepared. Not only that, they were veterans to the program. Survey teams consisting of individuals with field work experience undergo specific training and are required to pass an assessment. All 4 of these men had passed their individual assessments and, at the time of their disappearance, had completed 32 survey tasks in the Yunnan province that year. Overall, given all these factors, the likelihood of an accident seems pretty low. Low, but not impossible. So let's keep going. What happened once those men physically entered the Islaus on November 13th? Upon entering the mountains, they traveled from the west side up to the east side where they measured a sample called number 6134. With the sample collected, they circled back around, starting their journey back down the mountain. The original plan was to set up camp and meet the man who had driven them there the following afternoon. Except by 4 p.m. on November 14th, the group had lost all contact. Their bodies would be discovered almost a week after their disappearance. Before we tackle the deaths and disappearances of these men, we need to go back to the internal NRCSC report from October 23, 2021. Less than a month before the group vanished, reports state that NRCSC hired a local guide to help conduct a preliminary route survey. However, there's no indication a local guide accompanied the men on their trip. Oddly enough, other outside reports specifically state the group decided to do the survey alone after failing to hire a local guide. The men's driver, who was meant to pick them up on the 14th, even confirmed the men entered the mountain alone for both the preparations and the actual survey. Why the discrepancy? This may seem like a small detail, but it's one of the many small details officials and experts cannot seem to agree on. They start with the NRCSC report, and they end with the details surrounding what actually killed these men. So let's move on to how rescuers found these guys. What exactly did it take to find these men? 10 helicopters, more than 50 drones, and 8,000 people. This was the total deployment for the search and rescue mission that lasted over a week's time, beginning on the evening of November 15th, when the local government immediately set up a rescue headquarters, and ending on the 23rd when the bodies were removed from the mountain. The teams entered the core of the Ilau Mountain National Nature Reserve. The mountains are high, the forests are dense, and the ravines are vertical and horizontal, and all of them are steep slopes. From November 15th to the 17th, they searched continuously until heavy rain and fog severely reduced visibility, forcing an end to the search. On the 20th, the local rescue headquarters sent additional personnel and formed 3 crossing teams of 24 members. They also set up a camp near the location of the last personnel to expand the search. Finally, on the 21st, a drone with thermal imaging flew over the area and discovered 3 people lying on the ground. Through additional thermal imaging, the headquarters determined the specific location of the 4th and final deceased man early on the 22nd, near a steep mountain by the other 3. The official report from the search and rescue headquarters was released at 9 that morning and explained all 4 geologist surveyors had been found deceased. The cause of death was not immediately obvious to authorities, but they were able to rule out several things based on their initial findings. While searching for the men, pieces of disposable raincoats were found discarded around the area the men were thought to have disappeared from. Among footprints found by the search and rescue team, there were paint marks left by the 4 people on the slate, traces of tree cutting, discarded machetes, and a simple shack covered with disposable raincoats as a makeshift roof. Upon investigating, it was instantly discovered untouched inside the shack. Those who came upon the scene described seeing the 4 men were in various stages of dress, some fully clothed while others were stripped down entirely, and eerily each man had a smile fixated on their face. On the 23rd, exactly 10 days after the men entered the mountains, their bodies were brought down. The investigation into their death, however, would continue through December 2021. Once the men were discovered, authorities and experts set out to determine what exactly happened to them. All 4 were strong, possessed survival experience, and they had plenty of food. Earlier, we also mentioned the RTK positioning system and RTK devices. Though their satellite phones were left in the car for unknown reasons, each one did bring an RTK device. By simply pressing a button, they could have used them to relay their positions to rescuers or to ensure that they were in the correct location. However, the devices were never turned on and were never used. When the search team first discovered the RTK equipment, they were surprised and confused as to why the devices were not used to send a distress signal. Some reports state it was widely understood this was the equipment's intended purpose and that the men would have understood the Geological Bureau would be able to locate them. Nevertheless, without the signal, it would be impossible to know where the men's exact position on the mountain was. This is where things start to get a bit muddy in the reportings. You can just as easily find articles disputing this fact along with other facts attached to this investigation. Some reports speculate the men may have been less experienced than believed. Theories that explicitly state that experience has nothing to do with it, and likely the RTK equipment experienced a failure due to the weather in the area, particularly at the elevation the men were surveying. If they were indeed inexperienced, it's possible they wouldn't have understood how the RTK worked, and it could also explain why they felt it was not a big deal to leave their satellite phones in their vehicles. What it does not explain is how the men had managed to complete 32 surveys prior, or how they were able to set up the RTK system to begin with, because remember, these men never received a local guide to assist their preparations. They had done all of this themselves. Also, the issue is not how the RTK was set up, but rather how none of the men seemed to use it for its intended emergency purpose. If you recall, sources said they recognized and confirmed the 4 men had served in the armed police force, noting them as former decorated officers. If that is the truth, then why are new reports speculating something entirely different? An interview with different individuals apparently connected to the NRCSC was published in a Chinese newspaper called Sanlian Life Weekly, which stated Zhang Yu and Yang Min, the oldest team members, used to only do logistics or kitchen work, but were transferred to forest investigation in September of 2021. Of course, the details surrounding their lives before forestry work remain more clouded than anything, as the investigation itself, and it's difficult to confirm their exact ranks with the NRCSC via the Chinese media. Details as important as these shouldn't be difficult to keep straight, but it appears that there are many important pieces of this puzzle that have either changed or simply left out entirely, or ignored. Regardless of the men's past experience or lack thereof, how would investigators explain the other curious details mentioned in their discovery? How would they explain one of the 4 members managing to be completely naked? Or even stranger, what would cause all 4 of them to be smiling post-mortem? Basically, according to Chinese officials and the PRC, or the Yunnan Province Republic of China, hypothermia could explain just about everything, so eventually that's what they put it down to as the cause of death. More specifically, the men suffered cardiogenic shock brought on by hypothermia. Officials even explained the smiles as muscles relaxing in relation to the positioning of the bodies. Investigators also stated the autopsy supported their claim, as well as forensic tests conducted by the Bureau. Interestingly, though, an autopsy report has never actually been released, only the cause of death as stated by officials. It's this detail, the lack of transparency, which has caused many to believe the authorities are not being totally honest. Withholding this information has only caused others to speculate theories of their own, theories we'll get into soon enough. First, we're going to finish exploring the hypothermia theory since it's what officials were the most public about, and to this day, it's still technically listed as their cause of death, well, publicly anyway. We will start with the weather conditions. Were they even worthy of bringing on sudden hypothermia? On November 13th, the day the men entered the mountains, there was light to moderate rain, with the temperature being around 11 degrees Celsius to 9 degrees Celsius, or between 52 to 48 degrees Fahrenheit. As for the next day, November 14th, the day the men would have been ascending the mountain, there was moderate rain with identical temperatures to the previous day. So while it would have been chilly, it definitely wouldn't have been hypothermia chilly. Now, this is the official weather report from that day, but believe it or not, even this detail has changed, so here we go again with the discrepancies. It's assumed that the weather details have changed simply because more information has been discovered, which is a fair assumption, However, it's still questionable, so let's question it. Initially, it was reported that the weather was typical for that time of year, but not extreme. The area had seen rainfall recently, and though there was a lot of it, temperatures did remain above 40 degrees most days, even through the night. Later reports indicated the mountain may have faced a severe weather storm, though there wasn't any evidence to support the idea of a storm so severe it could cause hypothermia. Earlier, we described what the men were wearing when they entered the mountain, and based on those descriptions, experts said their clothing was sufficient, furthering that their larger jackets protected them from the cold and their additional raincoats for the added rainfall. These were the same raincoats the men had willingly used to set up the roof of their temporary shelter on November 13th. Conflicting reports were coming out stating that the men's clothing would not have been suitable for this weather, citing that the men only wore disposable raincoats when entering the mountain and had taken them off at some point, causing the onset of hypothermia. Many people took issue with this detail, stating it simply was not true, and claiming officials were changing details to fit their hypothermia narrative. The NRCSC themselves stated that the clothing was most suitable for these conditions, arguing the men were all equipped in addition to being well dressed. The other detail people take issue with is the fact that the men had willingly built a perfectly functional shelter along with several tools. It would seem the group had everything they needed to survive the night, but yet they decided not to use any of it. Eventually, authorities proposed that the men had built their shelter prior to getting lost and ultimately dying from hypothermia. Their case was built on a few elements, one being that they had learned that the conditions that day were less than favorable, boasting heavy rain and severe fog. This information was provided by an unnamed forest ranger in the Yunnan. In the ranger's words, it was foggy after 3 o'clock on November 13th, and he could not even see 5 meters in front of him. He feared becoming lost and he did not enter the mountain with the men, but stated he even warned them that it wasn't safe. This seems a little bit sketchy, and it's not just me who feels this way. The unnamed witness seems to be the only witness to back up this information. Had conditions truly been that unsafe, there's no way the NRCSC or the men themselves would have ascended the mountain for overnight survey work. It's believed that if this man is indeed telling the truth, then park officials failed miserably at protecting the public, as the mountain had remained open all day up until the investigation until their disappearance started. Possibly the biggest piece of supporting evidence of the lost theory is that search and rescue personnel found the compass failed due to the mountain's magnetic field interference. This led investigators to believe in the possibility that the men's RTK devices experienced a similar issue. They combined these details with low visibility following the fog and rain to determine that the group would not have been able to find their way back from collecting their initial sample. Therefore, the men's camp was likely set up prior to them leaving to collect the sample. During the early stages of the investigation, hypothermia had already been publicly speculated as the most likely possibility, but it wasn't until December 5th, 2021, Yunnan officials named it as their working theory, and at this time remains the cause of death on their official death reports, yet the police remained in the area beyond December 5th, closing it off to the public with little explanation. The extended police presence made some feel uncomfortable and raised many questions as to why they remained even after the cause of death was announced and the bodies were removed. If the case was thought to be nothing more than hypothermia, then why did the police remain on the scene? And was the public in some sort of danger? What else had they been investigating as a possible cause of death? Without an autopsy being released, alternative theories have been proposed to account for the inconsistencies with hypothermia. How did these 4 perfectly healthy men die suddenly? Each of the men had gasoline with them, which was brought for the express purpose of starting fires, for no fire or traces were ever found. When it comes to the hypothermia theory, the strangest detail the public is asked to accept is the fact that none of these men even attempted to save their own lives at any point. Starting from the beginning, when they apparently willingly entered a mountain under presumably dangerous conditions, which if that were the case, these were conditions they were both trained to avoid, but also how to handle should they find themselves in a situation like this. We're asked to believe that they chose not to use their RTK devices to send distress signals once realizing they were lost, or even the fact that they removed their raincoats to create a shelter that they ultimately were not found using as shelter at the time of their passing. Not to mention, and this is probably the biggest one, these men were fully equipped with everything they would ever need to start a fire. 2 of the 3 men had been found clothed and been carrying backpacks, and within those 2 backpacks were small containers of gasoline as well as ignition sources. Yet, there was never any sign of a fire being made, which in terms of hypothermia making one would have quite literally saved their lives. That same question circulates throughout these articles all the time. Why would these local men choose any of this? And is it possible that something else happened? Locals and experts have put forth their theories, and there are quite a few of them, all ranging from the plausible to more fantastical. Each is worth getting into though, as they help paint a better picture of what could have happened by narrowing down what most likely did not happen. Starvation. Despite one article that attempts to claim the men did not have sufficient amount of food, we can rule out starvation. We know all evidence shows the men had more than sufficient amounts of food both in their makeshift shelter as well as inside the backpacks the men had been carrying with them when they died. Most importantly, search and rescue along with medical personnel who helped in the discovery reported none of the men showed any signs of starvation. Exhaustion. Was the survey too strenuous for the men? Had they bit off more than they could chew, causing cardiac arrest? The PRC's assessment is that the area in which the men were going to, the sample site, was known to have unpredictable weather and many steep slopes made more dangerous when wet. However, the men suffered no injuries to suggest that they had suffered any sort of fall or traveled through any significantly rough terrain. Also, according to several interviews with fellow geologists and mountaineers, the task performed by the 4 geologists was actually very routine, with the normal crossing to the sample site being 5 or 6 hours on the faster end of things, and maybe 10 hours on the slower. Not something that would typically send 1, let alone 4 men into sudden cardiac arrest. This was also the opinion of the NRCSC officials who had surveyed this mountain forest several times before. The Yeren. Much like the North American Bigfoot, the Yeren has been described as walking upright, standing over 2 meters or 6 feet in height, having long, tawny hair on all parts, especially on the scalp, having a face resembling both an ape and a human, and are known for being incredibly powerful. Also, like Bigfoot, the Yeren is known to live in densely forested areas. So, did the men encounter this creature in the forest? I mean, probably not. In the rescue team's visual observation of the victims, most were relatively well dressed and did not appear to have been inundated by wild animals, as they didn't show any physical signs of trauma. As far as fighting goes, I don't think even this creature can kill 4 strong men at once. Although, while we are on the topic, this goes for any snake bite theories too. If there were a poisonous snake involved, it couldn't bite 4 people at the same time and likely wouldn't even try. Lightning strikes. Bloggers have reported the idea of lightning strikes being the cause of the death. Some have studied the thermal imaging pictures released by the media in which 4 people seemed to be facing this same direction when they fell, leading to the theory that they were suddenly and at the same time struck by lightning. Concerning the 4th man, they further speculated that he did not die immediately, but instead climbed a distance before falling off a steep hurdle, which would explain his position in relation to the others. This type of multi-pronged lightning strike has been known to occur, but they typically only occur in thunderstorm-prone summers and not typically in the winter. It did rain during the time the men were there as well as most of November, but there are no reports showing that there was in fact a very bad lightning storm during that period. When this type of lightning strikes, it's known to cause differences in damage to varying individuals, but primarily damaging the nervous system, which can also cause brain damage. Serious burns are rare, though strikes do cause marks on the body's surface. These lightning lines may appear 24 hours later, whether the victim is alive and or dead. We do not have the autopsy, but we do know the search and rescue personnel did not report any burns on the bodies when describing the state of the 4 deceased men. Miasma. It's possible this theory leans less on science and more on ancient theories. Be them true or false, we can't really rule it out entirely. The stories are about some of the ancestors of the area having entered the humid and hot forest on the south side of the mountain, only to fall inexplicably ill. They suspected the gas was poisonous and introduced the miasma theory, which has attached itself to the area historically. Modern science can detect that animal and plant decay in humid environments can easily breed some bacteria such as tuberculosis, typhoid, tetanus, and others, but they usually infect patients through mosquito bites and skin damage. This is a typical concern in the summertime, but these men went missing in the winter, when there are far fewer mosquitoes, so it's highly unlikely. Though the infection process itself is not easy to detect, making it almost impossible to rule out entirely. As for the poisonous gas, well, just like bacteria, some toxic gases can be produced from animal and plant decay, including methane, hydrogen sulfide, ammonia, and more. But could that happen in this particular environment? This concentration of gases produced by animal and plant remains in outdoor forest settings cannot be compared to that of closed biogas tanks used in the study, meaning it's highly unlikely this would cause the immediate death of 4 people in such an open space. Mysterious illness, poisonous water, and the cover-up. This is probably the most popular theory, the one with the real potential in its validity. This one deserves its own category as it has received the most attention. Not by officials who claim hypothermia, of course, but notable experts in the area, retired geologists, former members of police, and several local residents, including those who still occupy villages on both the south and east end of the mountain. The theory follows the logic that the team may have all been poisoned, but not necessarily on purpose. This isn't a suggestion of murder, but rather a potential cover-up of an accidental poisoning. Apparently, poisoning in the Yunnan is not uncommon. Reports of locals accidentally eating poisonous mushrooms occur almost every single year, and local hospitals have even made nursery rhymes about these mushrooms in order to warn people about eating them indiscriminately. However, mushrooms aren't the only thing known to poison people in the Yunnan County, and they certainly aren't part of any cover-up. Instead, those who oppose the hypothermia theory believe the cover-up is actually related to a previous cover-up where a similar event took place between 1993 and 2003. During that time, 36 people died from an unknown illness in the exact same area. On to the cover-up and this alleged illness. In July of 1993, a villager entered his home to take a break and retrieve the tools needed to work on his home, and in the process, he witnessed his wife suddenly fall to the floor. He assumed she had fainted and rushed to her aid, but she began twitching and slipped into unconsciousness. The man called for help, and moments later, villagers explained the man himself also fell unconscious. The two never awoke again. Both of the deceased had no history of disease and died without any apparent cause. On the day of their funeral, a whole family in the same village also passed away under similar circumstances. The deaths led to rumors, speculations, and superstitions in the small village. In Yunnan, officials were alerted and a health director was dispatched to the Xiaogu village in order to conduct a medical investigation. At first, the investigators considered myocarditis as the reason for the victim's death, but this theory was dismissed because it would be impossible to kill 4 people instantly and without warning. Due to the lack of progress in the medical investigation, officials had to leave the village and move on to other tasks. A few days later, another man from the same village died in his sleep, and his brother's wife also died that same day. Only a few days later, that man's father also died. Like the previous deaths, none of the causes were evident, and all 3 deaths occurred under similar circumstances. In the following month, the village lost 5 more people to unknown causes. Yunnan Park officials informed the PRC, and the situation began to get more confusing. This led them to dispatch medical investigators to the village once more, and by this time, 14 people had already died. Medical officials now believed an endemic cardiomyopathy with high mortality rates called Kashan disease was responsible. They called for a meeting and told the villagers that Kashan disease was the culprit and advised everyone to take selenium to prevent and treat it. Despite obeying, the villagers continued to die suddenly and without cause for several more years. But examinations showed that they had not been deficient in selenium, which meant the officials had misdiagnosed the illness for a second time. The water. Autopsies were conducted on most of the recent victims, and medical examinations now theorize Coxsackie could be the culprit. This is a non-herpes virus which causes small blisters on the inside of the mouth and can be spread through water contaminated by feces. The investigation uncovered that most of the deaths took place during July and August, a season of abundant rainfall in the area. The source of rainfall is less than clean though. containing several contaminants including excrement from the livestock. Given this information, it appeared the water was the cause, so PRC and union officials began treating the contaminated water and cleaning the mountain spring water. Now, this clean mountain spring water was used for drinking after being disinfected in the summer. Arrangements were made for doctors to stay in the village and observe, just in case anyone showing symptoms again could be treated as quickly as possible. The cover-up. The solution worked until 2002 when 24 people fell ill from June to August, but medical personnel were stationed in the village and only 8 of the victims died. There were 36 deaths in the village between 1993 and 2003 caused by an unknown illness. Eventually in 2003, health officials took an extreme measure. Those living there were evicted forcibly without any explanation. The entire village was evacuated and moved further away from the mountain and water source. That's right, instead of identifying the cause of the problem and stopping it, they simply and forcibly moved those inside the area away from it. While this seemed to curb the problem of the mysterious deaths in the area, the actual illness and cause remained, and still to this day, remain unknown. November 13th, 2021. Now we are jumping back to November 13th, 2021, when the 4 geologists ended up in the same area as the previously contaminated water source, which was theorized to be responsible for the 36 deaths and was not far from the nearby village. The official theory states that the geologists unknowingly filled their water bottles with contaminated spring water, and when they drank the water, they ended up contracting the same mysterious illness from 28 years prior. As for the man who was discovered further away from the rest, unclothed, experts believe the man had less of the contaminated water, causing him to survive longer but became ill and disoriented, subsequently going into a sort of psychosis before removing his clothing and eventually dying from a combination of exposure and contaminated water. Many believe the hypothermia explanation to be a lie and theorize that since Yunnan officials and PRC never actually solved the problem which previously claimed so many lives, they have great incentive to cover up the official cause if related to contaminated water. The theory is rejected by those who claim hypothermia is responsible, but it's not exactly widely rejected because not only is there no autopsy report, but also no public independent studies were ever conducted on the men's bodies, which were released to the PRC government instead of the local medical examiner's office or the families. Perhaps authorities and officials were aware of something deadly in the area. Despite having done nothing to resolve it, maybe they hoped it was just a problem of the past. Or maybe they thought that so long as they continued to control the narrative, they could just sweep it under the rug. Well guys, now that we've untangled the web of a mystery a bit, or possibly further tangled it, my bad, I gotta know, what do you think happened to these 4 Chinese geologists? When it comes to their manner of death, how true are officials' claims? Are they lying? Simply claiming hypothermia to avoid any scrutiny over the mysterious illness of the area? Perhaps they are trying to avoid liability claims over water treatment negligence. Or maybe, just maybe, it really was hypothermia. I mean, after everything we've heard, I think it's safe to say that the cover-up theory is about as plausible as the hypothermia one, which is pretty dang plausible, with a basket of theories to pick from, and more being invented every single day. Drop your own comments, and let's see how many votes we can get for the real culprit. Bigfoot. Okay, I'm just kidding about the Bigfoot thing, but I would love to know your thoughts in the comments down below. Welcome back, Swamp Folk. It's good to see you back for another video and another new year. Maybe I'm just getting old, but it feels like these years are going by much faster than they used to, that's for sure. Regardless, we're about to discuss the technically unsolved double murder of Julie Williams and Lolly Winans from 1996. More commonly known as the Shenandoah murders, the couple was simply enjoying a romantic getaway when their lives were tragically cut short. Wikipedia lists Shenandoah National Park as having just under 80,000 acres and encompassing 8 counties along with parts of the Blue Ridge Mountains in the Commonwealth of Virginia. Roughly 40% of the land has been designated as wilderness areas and is protected by the National Wilderness Preservation System. Most of the park's main road, Skyline Drive, traces along the mountain's ridge lines. The Shenandoah River and its broad valley are on the west, and the rolling hills of the Virginia Piedmont are on to the east. Legislation to create the park was first introduced in 1901, but even Theodore Roosevelt's support wasn't enough to get the job done. Thus far, national parks were solely located in the West. The first eastern parks weren't established until 1919, and even then it was an additional 6 years before plans for Shenandoah were authorized in 1925. That's when the real struggles began. The creation of this park could be its own episode, but it finally became official on December 26, 1935. One particularly interesting detail I noticed when researching the park is that it seems to have less crime than many others we've discussed. While yes, there are some incidents and accidents to happen, there hasn't been a single murder since those of Julie and Lolly in 1996. Anyways, now that you know a little bit about Shenandoah, let's get right to business. Julie was 24 years old and Lolly was 26. They met in the 1990s when they were both members of the Woods Women, a now defunct organization for women who enjoy learning and adventure. Both ladies were survivors of sexual assault and felt this group gave them a renewed sense of physical embodiment, power, and autonomy. Soon after, their friendship began to evolve, and the two fell in love. According to Blue Ridge Outdoors magazine, Lolly was a good-time girl who enjoyed drinking and smoking. She was born in Michigan, and in 1994 she enrolled in Maine's Unity College hoping to become a wilderness guide. Those close to Julie described her as a geologist in the making, a higher achiever, and a sports enthusiast. In college, she traveled to Europe where she studied the extinction of the dinosaurs. After completing her education, she moved to Vermont where she worked in a bookstore while searching for her dream job, which may have been the one she was set to begin in Lake Champlain on June 1st, 1996. Her future seemed bright and limitless when she and Lolly planned a trip to Shenandoah as a celebration. In May, just a few weeks before Julie was set to begin her new job, the couple took their golden retriever, Taj, on a backpacking trip through Shenandoah. On Sunday, the 19th, they set off into the woods of White Oak Canyon Trail, pitched their tent, and emerged a few days later when the weather turned sour. The ladies were able to catch a ride with the park ranger and renew their camping permit before returning to the woods, which was around or on the 24th. With the rain gone, they climbed the Hawksbill Mountain before making camp next to a stream. Interestingly, they were actually quite close to the Appalachian Trail, so close that this case was almost included in our trail's deep dive. Did you catch that episode? If not, you should definitely check it out. You can find a link in the description. Sadly, Julie and Lolly would never be seen alive again. On May 31st, Julie's father, Thomas Williams, reported his daughter missing, and a search was soon underway. The girl's vehicle was discovered north of Skyland Lodge, and hasty searches were conducted throughout the trail corridors in that area, hoping to bring a quick resolution to the case. While there was no sign of the women the first day, Taj was found wandering around unleashed. It was the next evening when park rangers discovered the missing women's campsite on Bridle Trail, and with it, their bodies. It was only half a mile away from Skyland Lodge, and being the weekend after Memorial Day, the lodge was absolutely packed. Countless people came and went during the murder's possible time frame. Within a 10-minute walk from a popular location, 2 women were bound, gagged, assaulted, and had their throats slit before the killer vanished. If you're wondering how such a brutal crime scene could remain undetected for such a period of time, that can be explained by a regulation requiring backpackers to camp away from designated trails, fire roads, and developed areas. Julie and Lolly were only following the rules when they set up away from the high traffic locations. This tragedy rocked the LGBT community, and for many, it put a hefty pause to all backcountry adventures. 1996 was a much more difficult time to be gay. There were certain rules society expected to have followed, and that's exactly what these women had done. They were minding their own business, far away from the judgmental minds of society, yet that still wasn't enough. When knowledge of the victim's sexual orientation was made public, it sparked nationwide conversations about wilderness safety and homophobic hate crimes. Unfortunately, this fact brought additional challenges to the investigation, which we'll cover in greater detail shortly. Since Shenandoah National Park is exclusively federal jurisdiction, The FBI took point to the investigation with assistance from the National Park Service and Virginia State Police. In the time since Julie and Loli's murders, some sources state that the authorities have followed up on an estimated of 15,000 leads, but there has been little to no progress made in the beginning. They didn't have their first suspect until July 1997 when a Canadian tourist was attacked. Yvonne Malbasha was riding her bike on Skyline Drive when a man in a truck forced her off the road and her bike. He then yelled sexual profanities as he exited the vehicle and tried to force Yvonne inside. Luckily, she was able to fight him off, but once back in his truck, he made several attempts to run her over. Thankfully, she was able to duck behind a tree, avoiding injury. Eventually, the man fled the area, but he was apprehended by park rangers when trying to leave the park. His identity was revealed as Daryl David Rice, and when investigators searched his vehicle, they found hidden hand and leg restraints inside. At the time of this attack, he was single, in his 20s, and living in Columbia, Maryland. In 1998, Rice pled guilty to the attempted abduction of Yvonne, and he received 135 months in a Petersburg, Virginia federal penitentiary. The interviews conducted after his arrest led prosecutors to believe he may have been involved with Julie and Loli's murders for a variety of reasons. There were the obvious parallels in the case, such as the geographical location and predatory behavior towards females. Though he had no previous criminal record, there is a mention of him being fired from a high school job for being extremely hostile at work. Former coworkers claimed he yelled profanities at them, punched a hole in the bathroom wall, stole their lunches, and even purposely bumped into them when they were carrying coffee. Needless to say, he was a bit of an asshole. This may not be much on its own, but at 8:05 p.m. on May 25, 1996, Rice was caught on camera as he entered the park at Front Royal, and at around 4:57 p.m. the next day, he was shown at Rockfish Gap. He also returned with friends, Carol and Robert Ruckett, on June 1st, which he freely admits, but he completely denied being in the park on the other occasions. On April 10, 2001, with only circumstantial evidence to go on, Attorney General John Ashcroft announced Rice's indictment for the murder of Julie and Loli. In a news conference, prosecutors alleged that Rice made several statements admitting his enjoyment for assaulting women because they are more quote-unquote vulnerable, and that he believed the victims deserved to die due to their romantic involvement with each other. Rice was ultimately charged with 4 counts of capital murder, half of which he allegedly claimed due were to his victim's sexual orientation, which made it a hate crime. This meant his indictment invoked a federal sentencing enhancement that introduced the death penalty, but he was never sentenced. After years of attempting to build a case against Rice, there was still no forensic evidence against him. In 2003, new hope emerged when a hair from the crime scene was tested for DNA, but it wasn't a match for the suspect or either victim, and the case fell apart. In 2004, the charges against Rice were dismissed without prejudice, meaning he could still be charged at a later date, and he was released from prison in 2011. His last reported sighting was in 2014 when the Durango, Colorado Police Department received multiple calls from frightened citizens saying they saw him in the area, but since there was no warrant for Rice's arrest at the time, there wasn't really anything they could do. In 2016, NBC Washington wrote of the FBI focusing its attention on the Shenandoah murders again. Special Agent Adam Lee was in charge of the FBI's Richmond Division, and even then, on the case's 20th anniversary, he didn't consider it to be cold. He even was quoted as saying, "We will stop at nothing to find justice in this case until we have exhausted every means. We continue to exploit the existing evidence and try to obtain new evidence. Julie and Loli are not forgotten by the FBI, and we are going to aggressively pursue every lead in this case." Even after the charges were dropped against Rice, the case was still being investigated as a hate crime, but Lee refused to discuss specifics. He merely said it would be irresponsible to speak of any new links that may have been discovered. It's also important to note that many were outraged by the handling of this case from the very beginning. An Outside Online article from May 2022 discusses the research done by journalist Catherine Miles concerning the efforts made by officials to minimize public relations damage and mitigate a sense of panic during their peak summer season. She argued that the reason behind waiting 5 years for a failed indictment rests with the NPS acting too slowly and the FBI performing ineptly. For anyone interested in a true deep dive of this case, Catherine Miles' book, Trailed: One Woman's Quest to Solve the Shenandoah Murders, is a must and was a great read for this video. It not only contains extensive research into the impact these murders had on the LGBT community, both women's lives and their relationship, it also provides an in-depth look at all the available information related to the investigation and investigators. In an interview with A&E TV, Miles described the FBI as keen on emphasizing that they really thought they had the right guy already. It's a sort of strange move. Secondly, it really seemed like the FBI was throwing the National Park Service under the bus. One point she made regarding how the crime scene was processed is that the law enforcement training tends to focus on urban crime. A key example includes how the first step in a homicide investigation is to secure the premises. This and so many other techniques simply can't be applied to a large outdoor area. Solving a murder that happened in a national forest is difficult enough, but due to limited funding, the Rangers were also understaffed and ill-equipped to handle the situation. Perhaps most interesting is her research into a second suspect by the name of Richard Mark Ivanitz, and her strange arguments that he may be the actual killer. If so, his reasons may have had more to do with a history of child abuse, mental illness, and sexual sadism than his victims' romantic preferences, but we simply can't be certain. In a WTVF article, Miles explains that several forensic psychologists and former FBI profilers describe the crime scene as sophisticated, planned, technical, and logical. They, along with Rice himself and the psychologist who interviewed him, also said that Daryl Rice was coming completely unraveled. It's also her opinion that the DNA evidence clears Rice completely. She believes the idea that Julie and Loli were killed for being lesbians was nothing more than a political invention by John Ashcroft and local prosecutors. They were under enormous pressure to solve the case, especially since it became public knowledge that the NPS and FBI recklessly delayed releasing the news of finding the women's bodies. What initially put Ivanitz in the spotlight was his proclivity towards assault and murder in the Southeast. Julie and Loli were only 2 of 8 young females killed in a specific section of central Virginia within a 14-month period, but what kept Ivanitz in the spotlight is the fact that his DNA matched 799 out of 800 positions against the crime scene's mystery hair. In the single place it failed to match, there is a phenomenon called heteroplasmy, which means the body misfires the protein. The FBI lab believed Ivanitz's DNA should be retested to determine if he was a true suspect. It was reportedly the agents who decided to go against the lab's advice and run additional tests on Rice's DNA instead. Based on information Miles gathered through the Freedom of Information Act, Ivanitz's DNA was never tested again. Now, considering he committed enough heinous crimes to have his own deep dive, you've probably been picturing him in prison. But he was still a free man this entire time when he committed suicide in 2002. Though it does seem police were closing in on him. Some sources state he told his sister, "I've killed more people than I can remember," just before ending his life. The point is, even if he were an official match for the DNA, he would never be brought to justice. When asked why she believed authorities never zeroed in on Ivanitz for the Shenandoah murders, Miles had 3 reasons. First, she theorized this was partially due to the Justice Department's unwillingness to back down, but the second reason was far more complicated. In 2002, enormous amounts of pressure to be hard on hate crime was placed on Attorney General John Ashcroft. Rice's case was the first to be the first federal hate crime trial in the nation. His indictment was announced in a national press conference where Ashcroft seemed to infer the indictment would somehow help our country heal from September 11th. Finally, she noticed that the investigators seemed to assume Ivanitz had a preference for children since some of his victims were young teens. She described it as their inability to understand that the same predator who goes after a 15 or 16-year-old girl could also go after a young-looking 24-year-old woman. A 2021 WUSA 9 article includes an interview with Deidre Enright, founder and director of the Innocence Project at the University of Virginia School of Law. This is a program where law students volunteer to investigate cases seeking exoneration for the wrongfully convicted. Enright also believes the answer to this case is sitting in an evidence locker at Quantico. She noted that the fact that a DNA test from 20 years ago only just failed to pinpoint the killer, and technology has made quite the advancement since that time. This was also the first source to specify the hairs were found beneath the duct tape, and there was also male DNA on the gag left in Julie's mouth. Decades ago, when Rice's lawyers first pointed to Ivanitz as the real killer, prosecutors said they had not one scintilla of evidence to support it. This also happened to be just before they dropped the charges. Tom Williams was also interviewed in this article. He fully rejected the idea that Ivanitz may be his daughter's murderer. He was quoted as saying, "I think it's a ruse. They, being the FBI, are not the kind of people that are going to try and pin some guilt on somebody that's not guilty. They just aren't." Whether you agree or disagree with his statement, please remember this is a grieving father who has suffered one of the worst tragedies a human can possibly endure. Look, I've never understood much about politics if I'm being honest, but despite everything else, Julie and Loli's families deserve to know what really happened to their loved ones. They've been waiting for closure far too long already, plus at least half of the nation has been following this case for over 25 years. Come on already. Well guys, once again that's the end of another episode. Who do you think is the actual killer here? Do you think Daryl Rice killed Julie and Loli? He just seemed like such a perfect fit, but DNA doesn't lie, my friends. I mean, I guess there could be human error here, but man, that's one crappy twist. Or do you think Richard Ivanitz is our actual murderer? I mean, 799 out of 100 positions is a pretty strong reason to retest if you ask me, but I'll stop harping on it for now. Missing in Yosemite, the Stacey heiress disappearance. Hey guys, I hope everyone's having a great day. But if you're not, I've got you covered. Today I'm going to be sharing a truly strange and tragic story. So sit back, relax, be sure to elbow that like button in the face, and subscribe to the channel if you're new, it helps us grow. Today's story takes us back to the summer of 1981, when 14-year-old Stacey Harris went on a guided tour in Yosemite National Park in California. She wore retainers on both her upper and lower teeth, and styled her shoulder-length blonde hair in an iconic Farrah Fawcett style. She had also attended prom with her boyfriend shortly before this trip. Despite only being 14 years old, Stacey was a known smoker. This is a judgment-free zone here. We all make questionable choices at that age, but most of us live long enough to regret them. Stacey, her father George, and 6 others took off on a 4-day trip through Yosemite's backcountry with 2 guides. The group rode horseback along the High Sierra Loop Trail at Tuolumne Meadows and arrived at the campsite on Friday afternoon, July 17th. The campsite is one of 5 within the High Sierra 49-mile loop, with each roughly a day's hike apart. There are 9 tent cabins which can accommodate up to 34 people. However, there is no running water or electricity. With the group's plan being to rest for the remainder of the day, Stacey opted to change into a t-shirt, off-white windbreaker, maroon and white shorts, and flip-flops to explore the trail with her Olympus camera. She invited her dad to join. He declined but suggested she wear hiking boots instead of flip-flops. My source material conflicts on this though. Some say she stayed in her flip-flops while others say she changed into her boots. Donning only her camera, cigarettes, and a pack of gum, Stacey heads toward one of the lakes in the area. Another hiker from the group named Gerald, an older man in his 70s, joined Stacey for about 20 to 30 minutes before stopping to rest while she continues on the trail. Back at the camp, the group's tour guide remembered noticing her standing on a rock about 50 yards south of the trail. If Stacey was headed to Sunrise Lake, which was the nearest lake and exactly a mile away, she would have made it to the lake in about an hour, probably less. I think this is most likely the location Stacey would have gone. It is very picturesque and accessible by simply following the trail. Maps show other bodies of water in the area. However, in the summer months, they likely wouldn't have even existed. They probably would have been dried up. A few hours later, another group of hikers approached the campsite and were asked if they had seen a girl matching Stacey's description, but they had not. At this point, her father, the tour group, and the staff from the High Sierra camp began scouting the area looking for Stacey. They contacted the park authorities and searched well into the night but were unsuccessful. The next morning, an official search by the National Park Service began. The search party included around 100 people and was comprised of volunteers, search and rescue members, and national park employees. Yosemite National Park consists of 1,200 square miles, but the search grid was 5 square miles around the campsite. The grid was established by the natural barriers in the area such as cliffs, ravines, and large rivers, as well as the reasonable distance they believed 14-year-old Stacy could have gone since she was last seen. Searchers were paid $4 an hour, which equates to about $13 an hour today, and rock climbers were paid $10 an hour, which would be about $30 to $65 an hour today. Half were paid searchers and half were unpaid volunteers. 3 helicopters also assisted in the 11-day search. Park officials reported the total cost of the effort to be about $55,000. To put this into perspective, that is close to $180,000 today. The Gabby Petito case, which was extremely high profile and searched over several months, took a full year to reach $180,000 in police payroll. Unlike the Gabby Petito case, sadly, Stacy Harris has never been found. 11 days may not seem like a very long time to search, but all reports suggest searches and team members were very detailed. The area Stacy went missing, Tuolumne Meadows, is the largest elevation meadow in the Sierra Nevada at 8,600 feet. Data for the temperatures in this area in 1981 are not exact. However, due to this altitude and time of year, temperatures can range from 90 degrees during the day to as low as 47 degrees at night. If she were lost or hurt stuck somewhere in that 5-mile radius, she should have been heard or found in those 11 days. Remember, Stacy was in a windbreaker and shorts. Temperatures at night would have been absolutely miserable for her. One volunteer brought a German Shepherd dog to aid in the search. However, nothing was found. German Shepherds, according to the handler, are best at tracking humans in general, whereas bloodhounds are the type of dogs you would give a specific scent sample to, and they could track the scent as you see in the movies. From what I can tell, no bloodhounds or cadaver dogs have been brought to the site, which is a huge miss for investigators. Hopes for finding Stacy Harris alive are not high, but her family deserves to know what happened. Cadaver dogs are able to pick up a scent within minutes of the death or even years later. In some studies, they have found 25-year-old skeletonized remains. Cadaver dogs were first used by Connecticut police in the 1980s, so it is reasonable that the Park Service would be aware and be able to find a cadaver dog handler willing to explore the area. Had the Park Service utilized these tactics in the late 80s, hell, even in the early or even late 90s, they may have had a chance of locating her body. Again, I think this is a huge mistake by investigators and calls into question if the right people were put in place to even solve this case. Now this is where things get especially frustrating. There are some big inconsistencies in the reporting of this case. First, some reports say Stacy's lens cap was found inside the tree line by the lake, but Park Superintendent Robert Benuiz says not a single clue was found. And another National Park Service ranger, Bob Johnson, said nothing significant was found as well. So which is it? If the lens cap was found, that would give us confirmation Stacy had at least made it to the area. Surely everyone would consider that a clue. If they didn't find it, well, that is even more alarming, so many reported it as found, without a single source to confirm it. Second is Gerald Stewart, the last person to interact with Stacy. He was the elderly gentleman in his 70s who accompanied her for the first 20 to 30 minutes of her walk. I say in his 70s because reports give his age anywhere from 72 to 77. Missing his age by a few years may not seem significant, but his name was withheld until years later. Nothing in the source material points to Gerald being a suspect, so why wasn't his name given? Or if his identity was to be shielded, why not just say that? How can we be sure that he was vetted properly if his age wasn't even accurate? Now surely a healthy 14-year-old Stacy could defend herself from a man in his 70s at 5'5" and 120 pounds. She could have at least drawn attention or left behind evidence of a struggle. I don't believe Gerald to be involved. However, the details of his age and name being incorrect in the reporting of this case with so few details leaves me questioning the thoroughness of this investigation. So, with that in mind, let's talk more about the investigation, or lack thereof. In addition to the 11-day search effort, the Park Service distributed missing posters of Stacy throughout the park. The first thing to rule out is Stacy being a runaway. Don't forget this is the 1980s, a time when all police reports act as if all missing children must be runaways because why else would they disappear? Officials do seem to have looked into this, citing that Stacy was having some family or school troubles, but she was 14. What 14-year-old isn't having family or school troubles? She was also said to be missing her boyfriend. Okay, sure, totally normal. But that's no indication that she ran off to meet him or to some sort of public phone. Remember, cell phones were something only thought of in sci-fi TV shows at this point in time. Ultimately, between wearing flip-flops, inviting her dad to accompany her to the lake, then a fellow group member, and the lack of belief from family she would run away based on these family and school troubles, officials do not believe Stacy ran away on her own accord. Besides this, the National Park Service doesn't seem especially forthcoming with their information. Documents released by the park mostly include short newspaper articles, pictures of Stacy provided by the family, copies of the missing poster used around the park, and a few letters written between Park Service departments regarding Stacy's search. Visitors are supposed to get a permit to use the backcountry, and we know investigators used these wilderness permits to determine which hikers were in the area at the time of Stacy's disappearance. These hikers were contacted to find potential witnesses, but we have no idea if these efforts yielded useful information or if they even spoke to anyone. The Fresno Bee reported foul play has not been ruled out per a park official after the intense 11-day search was called off. Park Superintendent Benuiz added the Park Service would still like to hear from any backpacker who may have been in the area at the time. Investors and journalists have submitted Freedom of Information Acts, or FOIAs, for the files, but all requests have been denied. Why? A denial response to the FOIA request says the requested records were withheld in accordance with Exemption 7A of FOIA exemption. 7A is basically to protect information for law enforcement purposes to protect the investigation or possible trial. But this makes absolutely no sense. Stacy Harris has been missing for 41 years. What could possibly be in those files that shouldn't be released? Her family deserves to know all of the information available, and they haven't seen them either. Does the National Park Service really consider this case open? If so, how? There appears to be no genuine movement or investigation that I can find. Researching this case had brought to light a disturbing fact. The federal government does not track the number of missing persons in national parks. Let me say that again. The federal government does not track the number of missing persons in national parks. Experts believe that at least 1,600 individuals go missing while visiting national parks throughout the United States. Seems like quite a lot of disappearances that the National Park Service would like to keep track of, right? We know the Park Service is inefficient, and at the time, communication across departments was particularly poor. Just the week before Stacy's disappearance, flights for water sampling were taking place in the area. One of the memos in the files is from Chief Ranger for Administrative Flights Charles W. Wendt. Chief Ranger Wendt wrote to the superintendent about these flights as no itinerary was provided to know where they would be and when. There was no memorandum in place which requested prior approval for all administrative flights, which the sampling team did not adhere to. Had these flights been in the area at the time of Stacy Harris' aerial search crew, lives could have been lost. I am empathetic to the time. Electronic communication was nothing like it is today, and records weren't digitized. I can understand the difficulty in keeping track of statistics without the aid of electronic reporting. But with today's technology, this is downright unacceptable. Okay, let's talk theories. First things first, we are talking about the wilderness, so let's discuss wild animals. Of course, animals could be a possibility. Yosemite has lots of wildlife someone could come across. Rattlesnakes, bobcats, black bears, coyotes, mountain lions, and more are all known to live in the park. Alright, black bears. They're the biggest on this list and the one I would be most afraid to run into. However, there are no reports of anyone being killed or seriously injured by a bear in Yosemite. That doesn't mean this doesn't happen though. These bears are pretty leery of people, but happy to steal your food. In fact, the same is true for most of these animals. Bobcats, coyotes, and mountain lions are unlikely to attack as long as you keep your distance and don't provoke them. Most importantly though, had any of these attacked Stacy, there would undoubtedly be evidence left behind. We would have blood, clothes, jewelry, her camera, or bones if she were the victim of an animal attack. For this reason, I feel it's pretty safe we can rule out the animal theory. But like I said, nothing can be ruled out entirely. Yosemite has lots of ledges, crevices, and slippery areas. It's entirely possible Stacy slipped or got hurt, but I can't help think she would have been found in the search or by one of the many park visitors in later years. Again, had cadaver dogs been used, we could rule this out with more certainty. Other theories believe Stacy's disappearance could be the result of something supernatural. Stacy seemingly disappeared without a trace, which leaves the door open for an alien or some sort of other supernatural speculation. But I'll let you draw your own conclusions on that. While more than a few serial killers have been known to use national parks for their business, no known serial killers were active in the area at the time of Stacy's disappearance, though the possibility of her being abducted cannot be ruled out. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. In fact, the lack of evidence in this case is what makes it so mystifying. It is not impossible that it was a crime of opportunity, carried out by an organized killer with access to resources that allowed them to buy time or hide and destroy evidence. Could this be a National Park Service member, or someone in the park's system protecting someone else? This would explain the absence of evidence and the lack of transparency on this case. Why else would anybody withhold information on a 40-year-old case? Why not allow someone else to try their hand? Jurisdiction for crimes like this are automatically federal, meaning the local law enforcement have no authority to work the case unless requested. Crimes that take place on federal lands within National Park Service can be handed over to the FBI, but as far as I can tell, their help was never requested, nor was help from local law enforcement. Is the National Park Service protecting a killer, or just their ego? I know what many are probably asking at this point in the story. So Swamp Dweller, what else can be done? We know so little, and the few facts we have in this case conflict, but there are some avenues that still can be explored. This case needs to be examined by an experienced cold case detective. We need all the information regarding the Stacy Arris case to be made available. Divers should search the Sunrise Lake for Stacy's possessions or remains. There has also been no mention of this occurring, and again I have to ask why. If finding a missing 14-year-old girl isn't a priority worth shelling out funding for, what is? While the lake certainly isn't small, an effort could be made with just a few searchers to cover that water rather quickly. There is so much that could be hidden in that body of water, just waiting to be uncovered. If Stacy's remains could be found, there is a chance that she could be identified. Forensics have changed drastically since 1981. Samples from Stacy's close relatives would allow investigators to run a search against all open Jane Doe cases throughout the United States. If Stacy was abducted or ran away by choice, she could be anywhere in the world. She might have descendants we don't know about. Forensic genealogy could also be used to compare her relatives' DNA to a public database such as GEDmatch, to find unknown descendants. If you've used any take-home DNA kits, you can upload your DNA profile to GEDmatch and opt in for it to be used with these types of searches. You never know, it could be you that helps identify a Jane or John Doe who would never have found their way home. If you have any information regarding the Stacy Arris case, you can call or text the National Park Service tip line or submit a tip on their website at nps.gov. Well guys, that's it for the disturbing story of Stacy Arris. What do you guys think of this one? I'd love to hear your thoughts and theories in the comments down below. That's all for this episode, but I will have something new in no time. And don't forget, there's always my second channel, The Dark Side Podcast. Just don't forget to show that like button just a little bit of love and elbow it in the face so it knows that you mean it. Be sure to subscribe if you're new, as it helps the channel grow. If you're listening to this on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, please give us a 5-star rating over there, as it helps us grow on those platforms. I have plenty more stories just like this one coming very soon. If you have a suggestion you'd like to make, be sure to send it on in. Be sure to join me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and I'll see you all soon with another creepy episode.